Welcome back to MBTI Gifts. Cue the thing.
Can you hold me? Can I hold you? If you love me.
Alright, today we're going to talk about introverted sensing versus introverted intuition. What is introverted sensing? What is introverted intuition? Well, those are perceiving functions according to the Jungian cognitive functional model, further developed by Briggs and Myers, and now popularized on the internet. So you're probably reading this, watching this, because you're looking into how introverted sensing and introverted intuition differ from each other, and I can understand because it's a little bit complicated to think about, and there's not a lot of information about this stuff, so you kind of take the morsels that you can find. But I have been looking into Carl Jung's thoughts on introverted intuition lately, and I found them pretty interesting, especially regarding symbols and patterns and dreams, things like that. He's very had a lot to say about that. So let's just take a look at what these two things are. These are perception functions. They are bringing information to your conscious mind from somewhere else in your own mind, based on sensory experiences you've had. So from that standpoint, if you are using introverted sensing or using introverted intuition, you will, in a sense, be learning from yourself, because you're going to be reviewing either your memories or idea models that you've got in your head. Everybody does both, by the way. It's just the personality type will dictate to what degree you rely on this for your day-to-day conscious awareness. So here we are with introverted sensing. Let's start with the now, because this is a timeline. It's going to go backwards because that's how introverted sensing works. So the main thing to keep in mind with introverted sensing is that people who exercise introverted sensing in their conscious stack, especially higher up, are going to be very good with concrete details and reference points, because they're heavily reliant on their own personal narrative to understand the world around them, and they're very good at bringing those details back up and almost like living in that world again, as if they were still there. It's a really interesting superpower to have if you are a higher level introverted sensor. So I've got these time markers going back in time with just some kind of arbitrary points on the timeline, such as yesterday, the day before yesterday, last week, last year. And I've got these little filing cabinets because when you're using introverted sensing, you're just going back into the filing cabinet of your history, the sensory experiences you've had, the things you've seen, just memories, concrete details. They don't mean anything until you give them meaning, and they may not even be accurate, but the point is you're thinking about things that have happened in the past. And so here's a representation of that. You have concrete SI impressions with exact details. There's no vagueness with introverted sensing. Introverted sensing is very specific. And here we've got SI perceives the reference and compares to pre-existing impressions. So what's happening here is, and not only are the past references being recalled, they're being recalled within the context of what's going on right now. So there's a connection point between something that's happening right now and something that happened in the past. So oftentimes it's something that's changed, or it could be a pattern that's noticed. So for example, if something happened last year, but it also happened last week, and it also happened the day before yesterday, introverted sensing would be able to pick up on those patterns, just to say, this is happening repeatedly. I've seen this before. I can remember these times when I've seen this before. So that's the gist of it. And as far as what you do with it at that point, or what your frame of reference is, that's going to depend on your other cognitive functions. Like, for example, if you're a TE user, an ISTJ, for example, these memories will be seen through the tool of extroverted thinking and like thinking about the protocols and effectiveness and the way you could use this memory to be effective and to stay organized. Whereas if you are an introverted sensor who uses extroverted feeling, you may rely on introverted sensing to recall the details of everything you've learned in your career, or you may recall prior situations that have happened and use those as a reference point when something new happens. So that's how, and you know, as far as the extroverted feeling side of things, an introverted sensor using extroverted feeling will combine those two things together. So it's not just your past history, it's also your past history and how you relate to everyone else, as far as society is concerned, as far as your social connections, your family, your friends, your relationships. And well, I'll do another video about extroverted feeling at some point, but extroverted feeling is about connectedness and being understood and not making waves and things like that. So you can see how an introverted sensor with extroverted feeling, like an ISFJ, is going to be very concerned with relying on their memories of how things have been to achieve a harmonious outcome in the now. To give an example of that, I came up with these two little scenarios here. So you can imagine it, someone who's using introverted sensing saying, last Thursday I was in my Buick Regal and it was really cold. So you can see what's happening there is you're referencing something in the past and where you were and what the conditions were. I looked at the weather and noted that it was 25 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a very like dispassionate statement that I observed something, I noticed that it was this specific temperature, and that's the end of the story. So there's no real observation. I should say there might be observation, but there's nothing really. Meaning is not really an important part of this. Like, what does that mean exactly? It doesn't really matter. It's just introverted sensing. It's just going back and saying, here's the situation that happened to me. Here were the conditions and the details of that situation. Similarly, involving a rotten banana, you could say, yesterday I discovered that one of my bananas had gone rotten. When I was 8, I bit into a rotten banana and hated it. And then this is the particular banana in question and the memory of biting that rotten banana. So it's kind of similar. It's in this situation, you are having a situation happen to you now. It reminds, actually, you're describing a situation that happened to you yesterday and how it related to something that happened to you 8 years ago, and you're using a particular moment to define the difference between those two, and that's how that memory comes up and how it's connected. So, and probably some introverted feeling involved there too, like, I didn't like that. So example, SI impressions tend to be very specific or detailed. They're typically linked to the subjective timeline of the person and tend to provide accurate, objective details that few would be able to argue with, not focused necessarily on deeper meaning beneath the surface, and the final impression is very straightforward. So I have detailed impressions plus time context. Time context equals introverted sensing. So let's contrast that with introverted intuition, and you'll see that it's got some similarities, but quite different in some ways. Here we are looking at a timeline again. I'm going to zoom out, give you a second to like kind of digest what you're looking at, but up here on the front side, on the right side, we have the prompt. So this is the now, and the NI perceives a reference. So let's go back in time before we get to this, because there's some explaining that has to be done. So we're going back yesterday, last week, last year, same as before. And as we're all the way on the left, you can see that there are these SE dots here, these sensory experiences. SE data forms meaning in the subconscious. So what's happening is the NI user in this case is experiencing something sensory, and that's affecting their subconscious. It's affecting their insights. So the insights are formed in the well of the subconscious. I did another video on introverted intuition, which I would recommend looking into, because I talk about the well quite a bit and how this process works. But you can see that there are abstract introverted intuition impressions that form here. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, everyone does this, so this is not a unique thing that nobody, that only 1% of the population does. No, everybody does this. You couldn't function as a human if you couldn't do this. But the difference between how an NI Dom would do this and how a lot of other people do it are pronounced. In other words, the NI Dom is going to be heavily reliant on this process to get through their day-to-day life and solving problems and things like that. So what's happening is, along this timeline, is as sensory data occurs, the NI user is gaining more insights. They're having more ideas about what's happening. They're building a mental model of the world and how the world works. And these are very abstract things that are symbolic in many cases. So an NI user may not be able to articulate a lot of these things, but they are building up a constant model of how the world works over time as more sensory input comes in, and they have more time to cross-reference things internally. And that's why wisdom comes with age, because you are building up your intuition by having more sensory experiences and by cross-referencing all of your intuition back and forth and building these idea models of how the world works. Sometimes they can be very wrong, but the point is you've got a model in your head of the idea framework of how everything works, really how the whole universe works, your own concept of the universe. So you see here with NI, very few concrete details or reference points can be recalled. Most sensory detail is experienced, then dropped. So what's really happening here is the sensory detail comes in, there's an impression that's made, and then the sensory detail itself, oftentimes the memory of it is dropped, and what's left is the impression of that sensory detail. So a lot of times people who prefer introverted intuition have difficulty remembering sensory details, but they can certainly tell you how they related to what happened, or what the impression of what they saw or what occurred was, or maybe how they felt about it, or maybe how other people felt about it. There could be a lot of different ways that an introverted intuitive could perceive an event and how they could store that away in their intuition, but most likely it's not going to be the same way that an introverted sensor will do, where they actually store the details of the event itself. So if we're going to use the car and the banana analogies, again, here's the car statement. It gets so cold in the winter, I can't see past the frost when I'm inside my car. I wonder how frost forms. This has nothing to do with productivity. It's not a TE concept. It's not about doing anything. It's not SE. It's not necessarily about your feelings. It's not necessarily about a past sensory detail. It's not necessarily about the possibilities of what's going to happen. It's just an insight. It's just something that it's just an idea that you have about, oh, my perception is blocked by this frost when I'm inside the car. And then that leads to another connecting idea, or question really, which is, I wonder how frost forms. So then what's happening there is probably a TI moment, but it's sort of like a continuation of the insight. It's like I have these insights, and then that's making me realize that there's maybe another insight that I could be having, or that there's something that I could learn. So there's kind of a focus on what don't I know about this situation, and that's what introverted intuition is often very focused on and very curious about, is here are the things I know about this, but what don't I know? And that's where the ideas form. Let's look at bananas though. So bananas go through a cool looking gradient effect while they're ripening. This doesn't have anything to do with any particular banana I've eaten. It doesn't have anything to do with my past. It does have to do with sensory observations that I've made, but it really is about connecting those together into something meaningful, into an idea, which is that bananas tend to look like a gradient when they're ripening. That's just a very subjective idea, and it doesn't. It's not really. It's not really disprovable either. Just like the SI data is not disprovable. It's sort of just that's your insight, and it could be true. It could be false. It's making a generalized observation about a sequence of things. So here's what we've got: generalized, synthesized, timeless conclusions. And here are some example NI impressions. It's abstract, it's a generalization, it's a personal insight, it's a fixation on unknown or missing information, generally not tied to a specific point in time, entirely subjective conclusion, could be complete fantasy since it's based on general impression rather than details, and the final impression is a synthesis. So it's taking various pieces and connecting them together into some idea or new meaning. So the similarities, both are subjective perception, and so since it's subjective, in the commonly understood way that we use subjective, meaning nobody can just like tell you that your perception, you didn't perceive what you perceived, because you did. You might have perceived something that didn't square with what you might call objective reality, but it doesn't make it any less true to you. So if you have an insight with introverted intuition, or you have a memory with introverted sensing, to you that's as real as anything else. Both form impressions that contain sensory data. So if you're using introverted sensing, it's not that you don't ever use extroverted sensing. You have to use extroverted sensing to even get access to all the data that's there. It's just that introverted sensing focuses more on the subjective sensory experience and the history than it does on necessarily the sensory experience in the moment. And of course, introverted intuition contains a lot of sensory data. In fact, introverted intuitives do a lot of visual simulation in their heads. And in a strange way, introverted intuition allows people who use it to quote-unquote see things that aren't really there, seeing ideas in a strange way, be able to see how things connect, but you're not actually looking at anything. So that's why they call it insight, right? Because you're looking inward and you're having a sight. Okay. So let's look at number 3 here. Both have a filing and recall system. You can pull up your idea models in your head of like how you think the world works, and ideas you've had and stories you've come up with and all of those things. You can also recall sensory details, things you've seen and heard, experiences you've had. So they both work in the same way in that sense. And they both utilize the connection between impressions. Introverted sensing notices when something happens over and over again, or when something is different. Oftentimes that will be the trigger that causes somebody to use introverted sensing. This reminds me of something. In the sense of the introverted intuitive, they're noticing the connections between ideas. So let's get down to the differences, because this is where we're going to see that. So differences: introverted sensing is subjective fixation on what's in the impression itself. So there's not necessarily any focus on what this impression means or how it connects to other impressions or ideas. It has more to do with the details of what happened itself. And NI is subjective fixation on the patterns formed by the impression. So it's a bit of a blurrier way of looking at the past or looking at other events, because it's not necessarily focused on exactly what happened. It's focused on the overall pattern that is formed by what happened. Introverted sensing sees detailed impressions within the context of time, and introverted intuition sees generalized, synthesized, timeless conclusions. It's not to say that introverted intuition isn't also very focused on time, because it is, but just that introverted intuition does not need time to work. It can be completely unbound by time and oftentimes focuses on the future, which is my next point, stealing my own thunder. SI tends to focus on how the present relates to the past, and NI tends to focus on how the present relates to the future. And this is not 100% of the time, but generally speaking, if you are thinking about the past, you're having to recall data, you're having to recall what happened, and you're probably using introverted sensing. If you're thinking about the future, you may still be using introverted sensing to connect what has happened in the past to what could happen in the future, but very likely you're having to use a lot of idea models in your head and understanding of how the world works or how things connect together to imagine a future that looks like X, Y, and Z. And lastly, introverted sensing learns by noticing patterns in past experiences, and introverted intuition learns by noticing patterns in ideas. That's introverted sensing and introverted intuition. Thanks very much for joining me on this video. I hope you found it interesting. Stay tuned. I have a few new video ideas that I'm working on. Unfortunately, these videos take me a long time to make, not because they take a long time to sit down and make the video, but because it takes a long time for me to figure this stuff out. I also would welcome you to come visit MBTIgifts.com, which is a gift website that I created that organizes gift recommendations based on personality type. Thanks a lot for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video.